Welcome to LaunchPod, a podcast made by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. At Next, we're on a mission to build a more ambitious, prosperous, and competitive Canada to shine a light on all of the bold entrepreneurs working to advance our ecosystem. So join us as we talk to those on the front lines as they share their stories of grit, determination, failure, and success. For our first episode, Next Canada alum Daniel Rodic, co-founder and CEO of Exact Media, will reconnect with his former professor and Next Canada's founder, Reza Satchu. Reza has successfully co-founded, built, and sold 3 companies and is currently managing partner of Alignvest. In part 1 of his story, he'll share his insights on growing up as an immigrant in Canada, his journey to Wall Street, and the ins and outs of mentorship. So let's begin.
Thanks for taking the time to chat. And I think just from my perspective, I've been in I guess your orbit for almost a decade now. I think it would be overstating saying I've known you for 10 years, but I've been, had the privilege of being part of your class before Next
You're
ever
a glutton
existed.
For punishment, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to put it. But I'm just super excited to have this conversation with you to kind of tell some of my own favorite stories, to hear them again. Hopefully learn a couple of new things, and based on some of the stuff you sent, I think there's some interesting things we can talk about.
Terrific.
But one thing I think it's more of a recent learning for me was when we were kind of planning that event, we played ball hockey together. And I got the sense that hockey is really important to you as a form of entertainment. Who was your favorite hockey player growing up?
Well, so hockey's interesting for me because I emigrated to Canada and too late to learn how to play hockey. And so the first time I was actually on ice was when I was 35 years old, when I learned how to skate. But I grew up desperately wanting to play hockey because all the other kids could play hockey. And so what I played was the closest thing to ice hockey, which was ball hockey, which I've learned is actually much harder and much cooler than ice hockey. But my favorite player was definitely Wayne Gretzky. And in fact, I have 10 Gretzky rookie cards from the 79-80 season. Wow. I was a big hockey card collector. When I came from Kenya to Canada, it became something that I became quite obsessive about. So I always said one day I would learn how to play ice hockey. And so at the age of 35, in preparation for the Wayne Gretzky fantasy hockey camp, I learned to play for that.
Do you remember what the first game you watched on TV or live?
Yeah, so I remember I would never be able to watch the third period because it was too late, and so I'd watch the first 2 periods, and then my parents, I'd go to bed and wake up early in the morning, and my dad would have this game with me where he would very slowly reveal the score of the game, and it was both traumatic and fun because I never knew exactly who was going to win, but usually, unfortunately, the Leafs were losing. But I didn't actually see a game live until probably 10 years later. But I certainly remember watching ice hockey a lot from my TV.
What else was it like growing up here? And you moved here from Kenya. But tell me a bit more about what life was like in those first few years.
So moving here was interesting because 3 sort of unusual things happened to me. One is, I guess it was unusual in that we left, what seemed like a reasonably stable, comfortable place in Kenya to come to a place that we'd never been to, we'd never seen snow beforehand, didn't really know very many people. So it was a jarring experience, but it was an immigrant experience, I think, like many. What I think made it a little bit different for me was 2 things. One was I immediately skipped a grade. So that tells you a little bit, it's remarkable that the Mombasa education system, was apparently more advanced than the Toronto education system. But I did skip a grade. And then the third thing that happened, which I think was probably a little bit unusual, was most immigrants, when they come to a country like Canada, not surprisingly, they hang out with immigrants from their country, right? So if you're Greek, you hang out with folks and other Greeks. I came from a community called the Ismaili community, and my parents made a somewhat conscious decision to separate us from that community. So my brother and I didn't really grow up as part of any immigrant community, even though we were immigrants to this country. And so I think the combination of immigrating, skipping a grade, and then being sort of a sink or swim mentality where we're not here as part of a community, but rather trying to figure out where we're going to find our lane, created an interesting dynamic. I think the positive of it was my mom, my dad, my brother, and I kind of as a very tight circle trying to make stuff happen. The negative of it was, you often felt somewhat isolated, obviously being in a new environment. But I'd say that we were very driven to overcome really obstacles not of our own choosing, but obstacles that each little obstacle we overcame gave us more and more confidence. And of course, we saw, our trajectory improve each year from kind of, coming here, living in a very small place in Scarborough to each year things getting a little better.
And when you moved here with your family, I imagine your parents had their own stresses in, not even raising you, but also just living their own lives. Like,
I would say that my parents are the true heroes here. And frankly, I think people who choose to immigrate for the betterment of their children, I have a huge degree of respect for them because in many ways it's hardest for them. My parents immigrated here and left a place where they, it was reasonably comfortable to sort of start over again. Neither of my parents had gone to college. My mom came here and became a secretary. And then my dad really spent 2 or 3 years figuring out what to do. Didn't really know what to do. And I think he thought about everything from buying a little grocery store to things like that. And I think he also had one foot still in Kenya. And so I think he was less committed to Canada. But then he found something that he felt passionately for. But I think for them, it couldn't have been easy.
And so what would your interactions be with them on like a day-to-day basis? Did you spend a lot of time with them, or was it?
Yeah, my parents were very present. They were fantastic parents, but there were trade-offs, right? So for example, we went to a public school in Scarborough, but I suppose didn't have the money to live close enough to that school to walk back and forth, whereas every other kid could walk back and forth. And so, every other kid went home for lunch. We didn't. Every other kid could walk home from school. We had to wait, a couple of hours for my parents to come back from work to pick us up. And so I think there were things like that where there were trade-offs, but it was never a feeling that my parents weren't trying their best. They were trying their best. It's just the cards that were dealt at that point in time. I think I've told you the story. So at the age of 10, and my brother's 8. And you got to remember the context, which is neither of my parents have gone to college beforehand, and we're in an apartment at Kingston and Eglinton in Scarborough, and my mother turns to me and says, "The two of you are going to Harvard," okay? Which was an absurd thought, a completely absurd thought. And of course, both of us end up going to Harvard, right? And so I think what they had was a belief that we could accomplish a lot of things. And I think that having at least one person in the world believe that is a very valuable thing.
It sounds like that was not just the kind of only moment where your parents instilled that confidence, because as all this stuff I've read and we've spoken, it's like your parents were one of the key drivers who consistently gave you that boost of confidence, kept you pushing yourself and developing and facing challenges and things like that. So what are some other examples of ways they built your confidence?
Look, I think that, so I think that is accurate, that they certainly tried their best to build our confidence, and my father in particular. And it was always remarkable to me that my father, who, grew up in Kenya, was sent to England for boarding school and lived in a variety of uncomfortable environments, had a really strong conviction that our family would progress and would succeed here in Canada. And I think that conviction really flowed through to us. And so we thought it was also quite possible. So, I can think of many little things. So, for example, at the age of 10, I had a paper route, and, I was the only kid at that age that was working. And it seemed a little scary to be out there delivering papers, in the evening, and it wasn't the safest neighborhood. And so, but my father pushed me to do it. And even though I think there were parts of him where he was thinking that this is dangerous, he had confidence that I could figure it out or learn something from it. And actually, my key learning from that paper route was a failure that I had where and I still think of it to this day. When you deliver papers, you have two kinds of customers. You have those that pay you weekly, and you have what's called subscribers. And the problem with subscribers is they only give you tips once a year, which is at Christmas. Okay, so it's critical that you make it to Christmas, because those tips could represent, 30-40% of your profits. And I was so miserable delivering these papers in the snow in November that this older kid kind of pounced on my weakness and said, "Hey, I'll buy the paper route from you." And he offered me something which was much less than what I was going to make 3 weeks later when I went for collection, and I sold it to him. And I've often thought to myself that, it was just a lack of resiliency. So it was a good teachable moment at the age of 11 to realize that you screwed up.
So I think one of the things that you mentioned is, being in Canada in this moment has really shaped your views on entrepreneurship. So you started it, pretty early with a paper route. And so thinking back to that time, after you sold your paper route before you're going to to college? Like, what are some of the other lessons or thoughts and
well, so
things that
let me just be clear. I should have mentioned this, which is I think very early on, I realized that the greatest thing that happened to my family was the opportunity to emigrate to Canada. Mm-hmm. Okay, so even during the hard times, it was clear to me that at least here we had the optionality to do something amazing and to build something that was pretty interesting as a family. So that's driven a lot of my behavior in terms of where I chose to live, where I choose to spend my time, what I care about. It was an event that very early on as a kid, I thought was a pivotal moment. And I always thought to myself that one day, perhaps I can do something interesting to pay it back. We actually emigrated here on Canada Day, on July 1st, 1976. And so, and I still remember becoming a citizen a few years later in 1981. It took us a long time to become citizens, 5 years. That is a very important event in my life. And I, in terms of the entrepreneurial journey, I think early on, in fact, I saw my father make something out of nothing as well. He became a real estate salesperson. And I still remember early on delivering, cards saying Reza Satchu sold this house for $32,000. And then, he became a really successful real estate fellow over the next 10 years or so. And so I watched him really act like an entrepreneur and make stuff happen and do things differently. And so I think that to me was a very important window to see what is possible over that series of teenage years. When I think about my teenage years, I don't feel like I hit my stride then, meaning I feel like I was a kid very much looking in from the outside. I mean, my parents had a lot of confidence in me, but I don't think that I had innate confidence at that point in time, meaning I wasn't someone who's going to stick my neck out. I wasn't someone who hit their stride, okay? And perhaps it was some of this dislocation, just getting comfortable with all of it. But I don't look back at my teenage years and say, that was a period of time when I knew exactly what I was doing. And I knew what I was motivated by, but I didn't know how to go about doing it, okay? And I think that there were certain things, like, for example, in grade 9, we're living in Scarborough, and my parents send me to this all-boys private school where I'm in chapel 4 times a week, right? So I'm not a Christian. I mean, I'm not particularly religious anyway, but it was sort of, again, a very weird experience. I think there was a lot of unusual things that happened, but they were character building, right? I often say that, having obstacles not of your own, sort of obstacles that aren't of your choosing, right? Like an immigrant experience or some of these experiences, they can be remarkably valuable because you learn a lot about yourself, right? You learn that you can do things that others perhaps can't. Or maybe they can, but they've never put themselves in a situation like that. I don't view my teenage years as years where I was necessarily, so entrepreneurial or such a leader making stuff happen. I view my teenage years as me trying to figure out, what my best stuff was, trying to figure out what path I was going to follow, trying to figure out, how I can compete and how some of the differences I have could be really powerful, but not really knowing what that looked like yet.
When did it start to crystallize for you when you hit your stride? Like, what were when did you start feeling the self-confidence to do the things that you're known for today?
There are 3 moments that I think about. First moment, I suppose, was when I was 18, 19 at McGill, and I met my wife, and she was beautiful, smart, and someone who we clicked early. So I think that was where, you sort of get a sense that, okay, well, this person's a great person, and we clearly have something to offer. So that was an interesting moment. I think the second moment was when I decided, if you think about sort of 1991 when I graduated, there was no entrepreneurial ecosystem. So this idea that you go start a business and that there'd be capital there for you, it just didn't exist. There were no incubators, none of this stuff. The equivalent of that was this thing called Wall Street. All the smartest kids were going to Wall Street. I didn't know anything about Wall Street. I'd never been to Wall Street, but I read this article and it talked about all the kids from Yale, Harvard, and Stanford were dying to go to Wall Street. I decided in my 4th year at McGill that I was going to try to go to Wall Street, even though there was no one recruiting at McGill. I think the reason I decided I want to go there, and there's probably some pros and cons to this, is I just thought, well, all these seemingly really smart people are going there. I don't know why they're going there, but they all seem to be going there. It was at that point where I thought, you know what, all these kids from McGill, that's not necessarily the group that I want to measure myself against. And just because all these kids are going to RBC or CIBC or wherever they're going, it doesn't mean that that's the playing field that I want. And so, and I'm happy to talk about that experience of getting on Wall Street because it was a pretty seminal experience. I think I've sent out 200 resumes and 200 letters and got rejected everywhere. And then finally I got on this strategy where I would call Canadians after 5 p.m. who worked on Wall Street with the hope that they'd pick up, and I'd have and Sharon Simmons at Merrill Lynch picked up. So within 2 minutes, I tried to give her my story, and she said, okay, where are you? And I fibbed, and I said I was in New York because I didn't want to introduce the concept that I didn't have a work visa and I'm in Canada and all this stuff. And she says to me, okay, well, why don't we meet in an hour? And I'm calling her from Toronto, okay? So I've got to backtrack very quickly, and somehow I convinced her to meet me the next morning. So I go to meet her the next morning, and I'll never forget because she's asking me these questions, and it's clear I have no clue what the answers are. And I'm way less versed than all these other kids that they interview. And she turns to me and says, look, Reza, you seem like a nice kid, but you don't know anything. And the people that we're interviewing can answer these questions much more thoroughly than you can. Why would we hire you? And it was at that point where I just said, you know what, it's time to just take a risk here. And I said, listen, here's the difference. The difference between me and the other kids is all those other kids got out of their dorm rooms, went to their elevator bank, saw a sign-up sheet which said who would like to interview for Merrill Lynch, put their name on, were called 2 weeks later, and were flown to see you. The difference between me and them is I only learned about Wall Street a year ago. You're the first person that I've met from Wall Street. I've been rejected 200 times, and I drove all night to be here to have this interview. And she liked it, you know? And so I think that was a teachable moment for me where your story can be very powerful in the face of others who seemingly might have better stories. And then the third event was when I went to Harvard to do my MBA, I remember the first day thinking, this is a mistake. There's no way I deserve to be here. It's probably one of the last times that I'm always confident, but it's probably the last time I can recall feeling a sense of really not sure whether I can compete or a lack of confidence. I remember walking into the class thinking, you know what, they always say that there are a couple of people that just slip through the cracks and get in, and I must be that person because everyone else here seems so damn impressive. And what was interesting to me about HBS, much more than what I learned from in the class, was what I learned about myself, which is that, you know, I am as smart as those kids. I can accomplish more. It was an important event for me from a confidence perspective.
And so the Harvard then is kind of a jumping off point into really the start of your what I call the true entrepreneurial career that you're known for. And so
look, I think I realized certainly at Harvard that ultimately at my core, I wanted to swing the bat. Okay, meaning, and what I meant by swing the bat was I wanted to be the guy making the decisions. And I wanted to be that guy as soon as possible. I was less afraid of failure. I was more afraid of just never getting up to bat. Okay, so for me, the concept of being in an advisory business or working for someone my whole life, even if the outcome economically or the probability of the outcome economically was better, I knew early on was not something that would make me feel great. I would rather have done worse and swung the bat and failed a bunch of times than done better and never swung the bat. And I think that was a learning I had at Harvard. And so I, at that point in time, realized that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. The reason I wanted to be an entrepreneur, maybe this has something to do with my childhood, I wanted to have freedom, right? So I wanted to have the freedom to make my own decisions, the freedom to figure out how to spend my own time, the freedom to figure out who I was going to work with, and perhaps most importantly, the freedom, if it worked, to really have an impact. That's what drove me. That's the reason I want to be an entrepreneur, is that it is the best way for me to get what I most want, which is freedom, and hopefully be a force for good and have people in my company or in the community follow in a way that was beneficial to hopefully a lot of people.
When you were finishing off Harvard, because you didn't jump into building your company right away, so why not?
So what I did do was I joined a startup private equity firm. So literally there were 3 partners and me, and they hadn't raised any money yet. Okay, so in my mind, it was a startup in training, meaning it was this incredible opportunity. So I turned down a number of larger, much more stable private equity opportunities to do this. And although I might have done it consciously, I think the reason I did that was because what intrigued me about this place was the entrepreneurial piece. what intrigued me about this place was, yes, there was risk that it wouldn't work, but I had a real opportunity to accelerate and learn not only a few things about private equity, but also learn things about how to build a business, both positive and negative. I viewed Fenway, which was the private equity firm I joined, as a startup in training for me. We started in a lawyer's office, not much bigger than this, with myself and 3 senior guys. I was the first junior person. And look, what I'd say is that experience became a hugely valuable experience. I think I've been quite fortunate in having people early in my career, people of real significance that took a real interest in what I was doing, perhaps took more credit than they should have for my success. But I think that's a great thing. I think that they increase the probability that I would be successful.
Mentorship is interesting because and we'll get to the next story, and it's a key part of it. But a lot of people, even after that experience, like, I'd love to have you as a mentor. I'd love to have this person as a mentor. I'm curious, like, how did you approach when you've noticed, like, hey, someone has some interest in being helpful to me? How did you approach the mentor
so I think this is an interesting thing, right? Because now I find myself on the other side. So the real question is people only have so much time to dedicate to younger people, meaning there's only so much time in the day. And so the question is how do you choose, how do you decide who you're going to spend your time on? And so for me, I think if I look at the 3 most important mentors in my life, I think I was good at figuring out, okay, who is someone that also is on a trajectory? And frankly, both of our trajectories could accelerate. And I also think that, I say this all the time, at the end of the day, there are 2 reasons why someone wants to be a mentor to you. One is because they think there's something about you or some level of optionality about you such that their impact or their advice could have a exponential effect. And it doesn't mean that it's always going to happen, but it means that there's some optionality around it. And so I think people saw in me some level of optionality. The second thing is a very basic human instinct, which is they got to like you, right? They've actually got to like you. They've got to want to actually spend time with you. They actually have to like your story and like your values and like what you're trying to do and feel like, okay, this is someone that I want to really help and bet on and spend time with. And so but the interesting thing about mentorship as you get older is if I think about, so at Merrill Lynch, my mentor was a guy named Stan O'Neill. Stan was a remarkable guy in that he was one of the first, he's an African-American. His grandfather or great-grandfather came over as a slave, and he grew up, he tells a story without running water in Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, so he was the head of my high yield group, which is where I started my job at Merrill. He ultimately became chairman and CEO of Merrill Lynch. I identified him as someone who had real potential. I think although he had a different story, I think we identified with each other in a way that was interesting. And I did great work for him. He wrote my reference letter to Harvard Business School. He invested in a variety of my businesses. And then he, of course, had a spectacular fall at Merrill Lynch. And so it's just interesting. And I re-engaged with him at that point and sent him a letter saying, look, because at the time he was getting crucified, I said, your legacy is much more than Merrill Lynch's stock price. It's in all the people like me who were inspired by what you did and have done more because of it, right? And so I think this whole concept of mentorship is an interesting thing, and it was certainly important for me. And at Fenway, there was a fellow named Peter Lamb who ran Fenway who took great interest in me, and at the age of 28, he made me a full partner at Fenway. Okay, so I had the 3rd largest economics we raised a $500 million fund, and then we raised a $1 billion fund. So it was an interesting point in my life where my wife and I had finally paid off our student debt. I was getting paid reasonably well. I had a really stable job.
Just to finish off this discussion on mentorship, whether it's with Stan O'Neill or with Peter or with others, let's say the moment after you left Merrill Lynch, you're now at Harvard Business School. What were some of the things you did to continue that relationship?
I think there's a balancing act between the level of interaction that you have. And so I was very careful to make it powerful and impactful when I interacted. And so either when I interacted, I'd probably go see him once or twice a year and became very close friends with his assistant, which is also key. And when I went, I either had something of significance to tell him or something of significance to ask him. And so I tried to make sure that the meetings were meaningful and short. I tried to make sure that we had some laughs. I think he didn't know where it was all going, but I think he saw in me some, like when I talked about the first point, he saw some optionality there. And so I think that is, when I think about my mentorship and why I created Next, it really has a lot to do with trying to find people who have real optionality, such that when I view my class as a mentorship class effectively. And so what I want to make sure of is that I am spending that time with people that, yes, I like, but also people that have tremendous optionality. And so hopefully there are a few of those. What I'd say is that, Daniel, to me, the joy I get is knowing that Next, or hoping that Next has a positive impact on people like you. And so, and I also know that the point I made is that Next will only be as strong as the alums. And so I think you're providing some great leadership to the rest of the alumni base in terms of what you're giving back, right? I always close my lectures, which is to whom much is given, much is expected. And so I do feel like Next gives a lot, and our expectation is that you will give back. And so I think that what you and others are doing is tremendously important to the organization.
Cool. Well, again, thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for tuning in to LaunchPod. We will continue the conversation with Reza and Daniel in part 2 of this episode, where Reza shares his insights on fundraising, why being liked is the kiss of death, and what it took to build Canada's first accelerator. To learn more about our 500 entrepreneurs and the work they're doing to put Canada on the global stage, please visit nextcanada.com. Thanks for tuning in to LaunchPod. Check back in often to hear from bold entrepreneurs paving the way for a more prosperous and competitive Canada. To learn more about our 500 entrepreneurs and the work they're doing to put Canada on the global stage, please visit nextcanada.com.